So, hello, I think I can start with our Brownbag presentation for today. I welcome everybody to our session, and for our participants, the usual rules apply. Please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation. You're welcome to ask questions afterwards. You can do this in three ways. One way is to raise your hand. The raise your hand function is under the reactions, or you can type your questions into the chat and I will pose the question, or you can turn on your camera and microphone and ask your question. We'd like to hear from as many of you as possible live in person, so that would be great to ask the questions directly. But in the meantime, please make sure to keep your cameras and microphones turned off. So I'm very glad to introduce our speaker for today's Brownbag seminar, Anna Pajvančić-Cizelj, who is a professor in Novi Sad, but currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Graz at the Center for Southeast European Studies, where she just began her fellowship with the title of today's presentation, Spatialities of Europeanization in the Western Balkans, which is an innovative kind of interdisciplinary approach of taking urban studies to the studies of Southeastern Europe through the lens of Europeanization. We're going to hear more about her conceptualizations. This is an early stage presentation, so this is more to get a sense of the project she will be leading at the University of Graz over the coming years. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Anna, and I'm looking forward to your presentation and the discussion. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So you could hear that I just started actually my Marie Curie project in October. So I obviously don't have any data to show and results now, but today I'm going to talk about actually my plans, what I'm going to do in the following 2 years. So this is the structure of my presentation. I will give some background, give some arguments, theoretical frameworks, aims and objectives, and finally discuss a bit methodology and also gender aspects of the project. So in the beginning, few words about the background of the project, or what led me to research this specific topic. So my primary field of expertise is urban sociology, or more specific, global urban studies. And this field deals with the urban phenomenon from a global perspective, and you can perhaps imagine that from this picture. So the world is increasingly urbanizing, and we're living in the world of cities that are starting to replace states as the only actors in the global political economic arena. And the cities are interconnected by various social, economic, political flows. So today, when we are researching some local phenomena, we also must observe how are they embedded in these global urban networks. But like many other fields in urban sociology, sociology in general perhaps, this field is also heavily influenced by, we might call it Western theoretical frameworks, but actually if we are looking into those frameworks, we see that those are built mostly from the US urban experiences. So in a way, we lack in-depth research about specific European perspectives. So this image you're seeing here is taken from the Global and World City Network page and shows data. Those data are a bit old, but it's not really important at the moment. But you can see a huge number of dots. Obviously in Europe, a lot of things are going on, but we still don't know what is behind those dots. So we don't have really specific, developed specific theoretical perspective that would explain globalization of cities in Europe. But if we go further, thinking about this picture, we can ask ourselves what is happening to other cities that are more ordinary in a way, or more peripheral, but they are also globalizing in a specific ways. And actually, this question initiated a so-called Southern turn in urban studies and a new research focus that is targeting the cities in global South. But now, at the moment, we have some kind of a binary distinction between this global North and global South, and one huge gap that is related to something that we might call the global East. It is like a new term that is emerging. This part of the world, for a very long time, we explained this by using this post-socialist cities frame. But this frame is obviously not sufficient enough to explain, for example, cities in Western Balkans. For example, if we want to explain something that is happening in Belgrade, it is highly questionable whether we can explain this by using this post-socialist framework. So this is the first gap I'm going to address in my project. And now we are going to the local level and focusing actually on cities in Europe. In this picture, you can see obviously Prague. And I put this picture here in presentation to represent a European city, but actually I want to make a digression. In one of the capital works of urban sociology that laid the foundation for all later works about European city, that was a work of Max Weber called Cities. Actually, the Prague was not considered a European city because Weber thought that ideal type of European city is only north of Alps. So everything that is southern or eastern was considered some kind of a mix of Oriental and European city. Why I'm mentioning this right now, just I think it's very important to be aware when you're searching contemporary phenomena, for example, European cities, to be aware that those kind of conceptualization actually existed throughout whole social thought about city throughout whole history. But to return to my project, in order to fill this gap I mentioned, I started from the idea that Europeanization actually frames a specific form of globalization of cities in Europe. And this idea, of course, is not new. We have quite a few research studies about it. I mentioned here some of those studies. But what is interesting to mention about those studies, that they focused on Europeanization of built environment and policies related to, for example, housing, transportation, public spaces, and so on. And here, built environment is not seen as something external to the society, neither the passive background of the society, but transformation of built environment is seen as a reflection of overall social transformation. So cities is here seen as a mark or a print of society in space. So if we are focusing on effects of Europeanization on built environment, we are actually investigating the social transformations that are initiated by this process of Europeanization. And this point can be presented by a quote from a famous architecture historian, Leonardo Bennovolo, in his book, European City, and I quote him: "European cities are born with Europe and in a sense give rise to Europe. They are perhaps the most important reason for the existence of Europe as a specific historical entity and the main characteristic of European identity. So European cities are, it can be argued, both the main creators as well as the main representative of what Europe is, and that is their analytical significance." So what are these features of European cities? What makes them specific? Or, of course, we can also ask a question whether something like this even exists. So based on the contemporary research, we will leave the Max Weber in history for a moment aside. European cities are characterized, especially comparing to the US cities, by high influence of public realm that is mostly seen in the area of urban planning, redistributive urban policies, high quality of urban services, infrastructures, relatively low levels of residential segregation, and so on. Of course, this is perhaps an ideal picture of European cities, and of course, this picture can be challenged. But there is also previous research about Europeanization process. And this research pointed to the fact that the level of engagement with Europe of different cities within the EU varies significantly. And also there are very different motives for cities to engage with the EU. So it is perhaps better to focus on those processes than to outcomes of Europeanization itself. So this European cities model, if you might trace it somewhere, it is perhaps mostly represented in a policy sense in this new Leipzig Charter. You're seeing in a picture on the left. And this charter highlights 3 dimensions: productive, just, and green. And these 3 dimensions are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, so economic, social, and environmental. And these principles, norms, and values are then diffused and downloaded both by the cities in EU, but also by the cities that are joining EU, and also the cities that doesn't have to do anything with EU, but because they can just copy those models, be inspired those models, and try to implement them in a different context. So just a quick remark, urban policies are not in the responsibility of European Union, but they're increasingly becoming the main focus of European regional policies. So this other document you're seeing on a picture at the bottom, this is the urban agenda for the EU. This agenda actually started a multi-level governance process through which aims actually to increase the EU coherence regarding the European urban models. So this urban agenda for the EU is a major process that is leading to the diffusion, transfer, and implementation of new Leipzig Charter, and also it can be seen as emerging new field of transnational urban politics. Now, I'm returning to the Balkans, which is obviously the main empirical focus of my research. And as I told at the beginning, this is kind of a blind spot in urban studies. So obviously we can pose many, many questions here, but I listed here just some of those questions that could later inform my empirical part of the research. So first of all, whether cities in Balkans are developing toward this ideal type of European city, and also what is the relationship between European models and some competitive models, different models that are also present in the Western Balkans. For example, I'm from Serbia, and I'm mostly informed at the moment about Serbian cities. But perhaps everybody know about this Belgrade waterfront project, and we now have a lot of papers, articles about that. And some of the articles, for example, call this Dubai model of urban development. So obviously we have different competing models of urban development that are happening in Western Balkan capitals. And also I would like to mention here a small digression. There is a book of a famous Serbian historian, Dubravka Stojanović, called Kaldrma I Asfalt. I'm not sure how to translate that on English, but the subtitle is Europeanization and Urbanization of Belgrade. And actually, Dubravka Stojanović is here showing that this between Belgrade as a European or non-European metropolis are actually the constitutive part of its identity. So it's present, these tensions are present throughout its whole history. So in a way, nothing new here. And then second question that is leading us perhaps a bit closer to my research project is a question about horizontal Europeanization. So where and what is the scope of interaction and exchange between European cities and cities in Western Balkans? So is there a horizontal Europeanization in that regard? And the second question that is also connected to this one is what are the interpretation and understanding of European urban norms and values concerning the urban development among those actors that are participating in various networks that are connecting cities? And actually, of my research. But what I also think that is interesting to see, to explore, is what is the motivation behind Europeanization of the city? So how do actors actually wage pros and cons of engaging with the EU if we're talking about urban development? And then one possible question is what are the manifest and latent functions of making city more European? For example, smaller and more peripheral cities can use this European flag to boost their competitiveness, to improve their international position, or for simple marketing promotion, actually without any substantial changes, which is sometimes the case in European Capital of Culture projects or similar projects. So obviously we also have a lot of latent functions in this process of Europeanization of cities. And finally, most importantly for my project, what are the spaces in which discourses and practices about European cities are transferred, adopted, rejected, and so on. So such spaces of exchange definitely exist on the level of European Union, but I want to explore whether also cities in Western Balkans and their actors take share in those debates. But of course, you can imagine that it would be quite difficult in empirical sense to explore all these questions. So I could, for example, analyze, conduct a document analysis and see whether spatial planning instruments, territorial governance instruments in Western Balkans acknowledge European urban models such as, for example, integrated urban development. But as all of you who work and deal with the Balkans probably know, this is a very specific context. And I think that many of these contextual factors would be left behind with a simple document analysis. So for me as a sociologist, it was very important to actually understand this context in order to achieve the aims of this project. And this is actually the reason why I came particularly to the center to learn more about this. I am from Western Balkans, but I didn't have a chance previously to engage with the Western Balkans as a researcher before. So in this sense, I'm looking forward to your feedback related to this research. So here are my main arguments and theoretical frameworks. So the first arguments, like something that I would like to add to the ongoing discussion, is that we need to go beyond the one-dimensionalism and city-centrism and works toward the multi-spatial and relational approach, both in urban studies and Europeanization studies. So what is this one-dimensionalism? I will try just briefly to explain this. First, we have for a very long time this methodological nationalism. So we imagined all the phenomena we were exploring in this territorial container of the national state. And then came globalization, and all of a sudden we forgot about national state, but obviously national state borders are still there. But we started talking about networks, flows, liquid society, and so on. And if we're talking about urban sociology is traditionally focused on city as a bounded territorial unit. And also, perhaps if we're talking about Europeanization studies, it is also focused either on a EU, either on a local level, either on a national state. But very rarely, all those studies are seeing a social phenomenon in relation to the multiple spaces they're embedded in simultaneously. I want here to emphasize this is the reason why my project is not called Europeanization of Western Balkan cities, but rather Spatialities of Europeanization in Western Balkans, because I also wanted to observe this urban dynamic beyond the physical boundaries of the city. So how will I do this? I will employ the comparative tactics developed by Jennifer Robinson. And Jennifer Robinson called these tactics thinking the cities through elsewhere. So actually she proposed to think cities through processes that connect them. And when we are thinking about processes that connect objects, in this case, those are cities, we could avoid this territorializing and essentializing trap when we are looking at the cities and giving them some predefined attributes, just because they are located geographically somewhere. So instead of supposing the Western Balkan city bears some essential features just because they're located physically in the Western Balkans, I would like to see in this project cities through various and often colliding processes and flows that connect them. And similarly to that, we also shouldn't imagine Western Balkans as a whole or European Union as a whole within this perspective as some kind of a territorial containers that have some features that are then just reflected in the cities, but also like dynamic constructs that are embedded in the various spatialities. In other words, this research is not comparative, but it is relational. So rather than defining strictly what is European city and then seeing, okay, whether some cities Western Balkan fit in that image or not, I will focus on processes and relations that are happening in between and where those models actually travel and being implemented in various contexts. I will also employ this DPSN framework. I will discuss this in a minute. And the second argument is that the cities and these interrelated spatialities are the strategic site where these discourses, practices about Europe are produced, reproduced, and transformed. And in this regard, I intend to make a communication between global urban studies and critical Europeanization studies. So now I will try just briefly to introduce this framework. It's not enough to, it's not important to go into details, but this DPSN framework is developed by Jessup, Brainerd, and Jones, and it is proposing a simultaneous focus on these four levels, so social spatial levels, so it's territory, place, skills, and network. And every spatial level has its own organizational logic. For example, organizing principle of the territories, bordering, bounding, partialization, and so on. Place is organized around the relationship of proximity, trust, embeddedness. Skills are characterized by vertical differentiation, hierarchies, and networks are, of course, concerned with interconnectivity, horizontal relations, and so on. And what these authors actually propose to observe every social phenomena in the intersections of all those spaces they're embedded in. What is also important here to emphasize that all these spaces are seen both as a spaces of agency and structure. So for example, belonging to a certain place can be seen as a structural constraint for actor, but also it can be seen as a place for agency for specific action. And second thing that is important to say that those spaces are seen not as a pre-given, not as a static, but as a socially produced during the social interactions of actors. So I will not go here into details. This is not important. I will just try briefly to explain how well I try to introduce this framework in the Europeanization studies. But first of all, I would obviously need some kind of conceptualization, adequate conceptualization of Europeanization for this kind of research. So for the beginning, I would conceptualize Europeanization as a new set of social spatial relations that is happening on the various scales. And these new social spatial relations could be seen as arenas where power, authority, mobilization happen. And therefore, they're highly politically relevant, but not sufficiently researched. And all these spaces can be seen both as a causes and consequences of Europeanization. And because of that, you can see of this table that is always Europeanization of something and Europeanization through something. Let me give an example. Eurocities. Eurocities is one of the most important European networks that is advocating European urban models. So Eurocities is in a way product of Europeanization, but it is also producing and transforming in a way this same process. So in this project, spaces, including networks, places, cities, territories, are seen not as a passive background against which these Europeanization forces are imposed, but they're rather seen as a strategic fields of action where Europeanization is constantly being produced, reproduced, transformed through the interactions of various actors. And also, you can imagine that it would be very, very difficult to explore all the possible, all these possible squares, and that's why I left those in gray and highlighted only this part I'm going actually to conduct in my research. So I'm going to focus just on intersections of networks and other spaces. So empirically speaking, the main focus of my research would be interurban networks that connect Western Balkan cities with organization and networks in European Union. So these are just aims and objectives. I'm not going to read all of them. You can see them on the picture. I'm going to just briefly say that one of the final aims is to actually develop some kind of a new, perhaps conceptualization of Europeanization, but it's perhaps too ambitious, but perhaps a new methodological tool for further research. Few words about the methodology. So actually, I already started to collect some of the data because I knew I had this presentation and I didn't want to speak all about just about concept. I want to show something. So you can see here a preliminary visualization based on the social network analysis on this picture. So for this kind of analysis, I conducted just some preliminary data about affiliations of various organizations from Western Balkans in the European interurban networks and organizations. So what you see here are affiliation networks because the connection between cities actually are established by the common affiliation in some organization. So obviously, I cannot focus on all possible connections, but I will just focus on those connections that are mediating the common European understanding of urban development. For example, I could separate knowledge networks and policy networks. Knowledge networks would be, for example, horizon projects that are dealing with European urban models that involve both partners from the EU and from Western Balkans. Or, for example, organizations such as Association of European Schools of Planning, and then we can have organization from Western Balkans participating. And from policy networks, there can be Eurocities, I also mentioned, or the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, and so on. So this particular map is based, as I said, on these affiliations of Western Balkan cities in European networks. And what can we see from this map? We can see several things. First, we can see the overall connectivity of the city, which also indicate the extent to which city is exposed to these European discourses and practices related to urban development. Obviously, on this picture, Zagreb is in the center, meaning that it's most involved, but also this preliminary data, this map can very easily be changed when I insert more data. So cities that are closer to the center are more involved, and cities that are on the peripheries of the map are less involved. And also, what can we see from this picture is how many connections Western Balkan cities share among themselves. So the more affiliations they share, they're closer together in the picture, and the line between them is thicker. So we can see here the connections between Western Balkan cities that are happening in the context of Europeanization. And if we modify this picture and see like organization instead of cities, we can also conclude, for example, which are the most important agents of Europeanization of Western Balkan cities in this regard. So which organization networks are more open, which are more closed in this sense. But project will, of course, not end here, because I would like to understand also those interpretations of actors, and that's why I'm going to conduct this qualitative network analysis, which is basically conducted by document analysis and, most importantly, expert interviews. So I will conduct expert interviews with the members of those organizations that are represented in all these dots. And finally, last but not the least, the gender aspects of the projects. This whole field of urban studies, especially architecture, urban planning, is still very gender blind, and that's why I think it's very important to also include this gender dimension. And I will especially focus on, I could say, feminist interurban alliances. So the networks that are actually promoting gender equality in the cities, such as this Fem Cities network with the Fem headquarters in Vienna. And I also already had some chance to do a research about this network. So this part of research would be in effect some kind of continuity from my previous research. Yes, I think I will stop here. I hope I'm within the time. And I am, of course, looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great, Anna. Thank you very much for introducing this project to us and raising also some kind of important questions in all of that. I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. So whoever would like to go first and ask any questions or comments, again, as I mentioned, you can either raise your hand, you can turn on your camera, you can write in the message in the chat, whatever you prefer, how you communicate with Anna your questions. So the floor is open. Maybe just to while everybody is thinking about their questions, my question for you would be, Anna, because I mean, you've mentioned also how being European is a performance very often. It can be, you know, this kind of act of showmanship, so to speak. And there's this book by Vjosa Musliu on Europeanization and state building as everyday practices, performing Europe in the Western Balkans. And she looks at the way in which Europe is performed by, she mostly looks at urban centers. I mean, she kind of takes less the urban studies or the city as an official lens of analysis, but she looks at Sarajevo, Podgorica, I believe, and Tirana, among others. And for example, how they're using Europe as a way to justify their projects, or to kind of say, you know, she was telling, for example, for Tirana, she's talking about how, you know, doing yoga in the park and riding bicycles becomes expressions of Europeanness, which the mayor is promoting. Of course, ironic considering that until 2 decades ago, bicycling was a sign of being socialist, and, you know, even the Chinese model was taking a bicycle, so to speak. And yoga is certainly maybe not entirely a European invention, but it's kind of this kind of signaling. So I'm just wondering, to which degree is this something which you're also thinking of including in your more kind of network-based analysis? How much this kind of you know, I wouldn't say substantial, but more performative sense of being European is part of, you know, you create these networks because you want to show that you're very European with certain values implied with it. How much is this something you were thinking of looking at?
Yes, I would definitely look closer into this book. Yes, I expect that I'm going to find, especially during these interviews, things like that. So I wanted to have in this project so both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So quantitative analysis is very useful, but of course it cannot show things you talked about. So these performative things and specific understandings and so on. But I'm still not sure. I must see how I'm going to construct the sample. But for example, if I'm going to talk with representatives of the cities, so for example, the person who is sitting in some kind of office, you know, within the city administration, I'm not sure that I'm going to, you know, go to see these kind of things you mentioned. So perhaps this is going to be one small part of research, but unfortunately, I'm not sure that I'm going to pick all this up during this particular project. But this is definitely something that I'm going to think about.
Thanks. Other questions from, I see there are some hands up. We have Anna and then Mina. So Anna, do you want to go ahead, turn on your mic and your camera, and we can hear your question?
I am.
Great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Anna, for your project presentation. It seems really interesting, and I can't wait to see the first results coming out of it. My question would be about the negotiation of this Western Balkans and European identity, especially from the framework, for example, of Zagreb, whose not only identity, but also some policy choices were going in direction of not being, you know, like territorially or culturally within the Western Balkans. So I'm wondering how are you going to negotiate with those notions in your research? Thanks.
So just to clarify, your question was how I'm going to methodologically explain why I also included Zagreb in the sample.
Maybe, but also like how would you approach this whole kind of clustering within Western Balkans, and then you know, like when you're going to conduct your interviews and so forth, how methodologically but also conceptually are you going to include Zagreb within the Western Balkans? It's also has to do with I don't know, some programs and planning, in sense of also going you know, that touch upon resources, in sense that okay, some projects are reserved for Western Balkans countries and so forth. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, now I understand the question. So one thing that I emphasized during the presentations, methodological thing, is that I'm not going to go for comparative research. So in a way, this is easier because I'm focusing on the processes. So I'm not going to classify, you know, cities according to whether they are in EU or not EU, because obviously all of those cities are exposed in a different ways to the Europeanization, European discourses related to urban development, but in a different way. What is a methodological challenge? And I'm right now actually thinking about it. So whether to include those networks that are exclusively reserved for the European cities. So there are some networks that Western Balkan city cannot participate. So for example, what I can do is to just exclude those networks and not to analyze them, just to focus on these that are open, and they can be equally, you know, cities in Western Balkans, and also European cities can participate in them. So this is like a methodological dilemma now.
Great, thanks, Anna. So Mina, over to you.
Again, thank you for your presentation. I think, first of all, I learned a lot from it, and I like that you are going to research this. However, I'm sorry if I missed, but could you please explain what cities you plan to include? I saw like capitals, but like others, how you gonna choose which ones, based on those projects or on something else?
Thank you very much for the question. It was my mistake because I didn't make that explicit. So I will, in this quantitative part, so social network analysis include so Skopje, Sarajevo, Zagreb, Belgrade, Pristina, Tirana, and Podgorica. Because this kind of analysis, you know, it's not hard to include many cities because it can handle a really huge amount of data. But in my original proposal, actually, I stated that I'm going to focus only on 3 cities, Belgrade, Zagreb, and Pristina. So because I could not conduct interviews in all cities, I will focus in this qualitative part only on these 3 cities.
Okay, thank you.
sorry, Angelina, do you want to go ahead? Your hand is up, so you can just turn on your microphone and your camera. Hello, can you hear us, Angelina?
Hello,
Yes.
hello.
Okay,
Sorry,
hi, yes.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me, Anna. It was a great presentation. And I don't really have just a real question. I just want maybe some opinion about theoretical issues about Western Balkans, and how Anna said Zagreb isn't in Western Balkans. Yes, but we can say formally and regarding to ex-Yugoslavia also. So it was also a good issue and a good start. What do you think about, and accordingly, we listen about semi-periphery, periphery, and the center in the context of that capital in the Western Balkan? What can be what we can see with small and small cities, small towns, accordingly to capital? Can we say that we have a new periphery and semi-periphery, and under the Europeanization process? What we can say, is it some kind of a new sub-national level? Because accordingly to negative socio-demographically trends, migration to European Union, liberalization of working groups according to Germany and Austria, so on. So we have demographic aging, we have a decline in the human capital, go on, you know. So what we can expect from that cities, especially towns, middle towns and the small towns, which are not capital, what we are for maybe 50 years in the future, we can say they will be abandoned. They will be just not part of the possible Europeanization process at all. You know, maybe it isn't just a core issue from your presentation, but just maybe we can share some about that.
Thank you very much, Angelina. Angelina is a part of advisory group of the project, and she's going to help me when I'm going to conduct the research in Zagreb. And thank you very much for this question. Actually, this is one of a contradictory thing in my project. In theoretical part, I'm talking about overcoming the city-centrism, and then I'm showing a picture with only capital cities. And I'm aware of this paradox. But I will definitely think about this during my project, because for example, in studies of globalization showed that globalization actually produces this huge gap within the national territories. So the peripheral cities are becoming even more peripheral in the context of globalization, and the capital cities are gaining in the importance. For example, in a whole post-socialist region. So perhaps if we're thinking about that, we can also ask the question: what is Europeanization producing related to the regional development and into this gap between the capital city and the more peripheral city? And we of course know that in almost all Western Balkan countries, we have a very significant gap between capitals and the rest of the national territories. So whether Europeanization doing something to solve these problem, or it's making this gap even more pronounced. So I definitely will think about this during the project.
Thanks. That's are there any other questions we have? Otherwise, I would have another maybe concluding one at this particular point in time. I mean, my question is about the role of the city in the larger society or the larger state. I mean, in the sense that I understand, of course, that the framework of analysis is the urban and I mean, and in fact, mostly the capital cities. But to which degree do you see them actually as being autonomous as actors? Because we know, especially many governments in the region, there's a very strong sense of control over the whole political structure from the state to the local. And also from Skopje 2014, the urban project, which was of course a very top-down, the prime minister himself ordering the construction of monuments, to the Belgrade waterfront, which is also very top-down, very much driven by state leadership rather than local leadership. So how much are actually cities autonomous actors in many of the countries of the Western Balkans, and how do you deal with that, or how much is this a problem or not for your research?
Yeah, I think this is perhaps one of the most significant theoretical problems, because we have these inherited theoretical frameworks, mostly from the US, but also from the Western Europe, that are supposing that our cities are autonomous. But in Western Balkans, the situation is different. So if we want to understand cities in Western Balkans within this framework, we must put a huger emphasis on national state, definitely. And that is why I think this DPSN framework would be helpful, because otherwise I could easily use the national state if I was just focused on cities. But because I'm using this framework, I was going to be always aware of how this is urban dynamic intersecting with the state dynamic. So I could not lose these things, your issues you raised, and I definitely agree that cities, I could say about Belgrade, for example, the most significant urban development projects are actually not autonomous decisions of a local government. Definitely, they are a product of the national state government. So this is one of the important issues I expect to encounter during the project, definitely.
That's going to be indeed quite a big challenge, but also maybe an original contribution to raise this awareness, because I fully agree with you that I think this, on the one side, this kind of very strong sense of kind of focusing on the Western models or American models. I mean, if you look at Benjamin Barber's book about, kind of the argument that let just the cities, let the world be run like cities and we're going to be fine. I mean, of course, it's a little bit simplistic, but that of course then leads to, first of all, misreading of many parts of the world, but it also kind of gives a strong focus on the technocratic. I mean, it says, if only the world is run in a very technocratic way without, ideology, things would be fine, things would get done. But of course, it underestimates that even in cities, the leadership is often not just purely technocratic, or this kind of technocratic focus is problematic in many ways. So indeed, if there are no further questions, I think we can conclude our session for today. And let me thank Anna for her presentation. We're looking forward to hearing a Brownbag in a year and a half or something like that, and hear the findings of the research in this format or another one. And I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions and participation. And we'll see each other at the next Brownbag seminar very soon. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.